invited a few others. This meeting is being recorded. I've invited a few others to join in. I think one will be able to make it and one can't. Oh, how do I make that thing go away?
Well, so with that, it is 8:01. If people would be conscious of muting themselves and background noise, that would be awesome. That way I don't have to run through and grab everybody. Mike, I did not think to put together an introduction for you. I have danced to you and enjoyed it very much. So why don't you take it away?
Well, I was fortunate to begin dancing and calling in the Los Angeles area. And that's where Bob Osgood and Brian, as you mentioned, Bob Van Antwerp that was their headquarters. And Sets in Order, American Square Dance magazine was in Beverly Hills, just over the hill from me. And Bob Van Antwerp was down in Long Beach. And anyway, there was a core of callers in the LA area that we had as mentors that really enabled us to learn a bunch about square dancing, visually see people, watching Osgood teach and Van Antwerp and those guys, and working with them was just a privilege, and just like I say, lucky to be there. I started calling in 1963, and in the 6th grade, and because I lost a bet to my mother, I had to try square dancing. But I had an argument with a 6th grade teacher who was teaching the Virginia Reel, and she was calling it a square dance, and I said, no, this is not a square dance, it's a contra dance, one line, and you don't have a square here. And she argued back and forth. And anyway, the bottom line was that she said, okay, smarty pants, teach us how to square dance. So I brought a 45 RPM, because in 63 we were using 45s at that time, and taught my class. And the next year, the caller for our club became ill and asked me to teach the class for the club, and said, call me and I'll tell you what to teach. But fortunately, because of Sets in Order and the references and the material there, I could use a lot of that printed material. So a lot of us, Brian, I'm sure you were that way, Daryl, Don, back in that day, that was a primary resource for us. Sets in Order, Square Dance magazine, the albums that came out with all the callers on them were just 3 minutes and 4 minutes of patter, and to be able to see that and experience those callers at that time was just a real gem for all of us. Bob actually started calling in about 1938, and when he was in college, he went to UCLA here in Los Angeles, and but then when the war broke out, he went into the Navy, and it wasn't until after the Navy that he actually went to Lloyd Shaw's College. And shortly afterwards, he was teaching callers. And but the interesting thing about him being in Beverly Hills is that it enabled him to work in the motion picture area. So he had private groups, like with Gene Kelly. He would go over to Gene Kelly's house, and they had a square there. Same thing with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis and Elizabeth Taylor. He literally was involved with television programs on square dancing, and wrote choreography, and actually worked on about 4 or 5 movies at that time. So one of the biggest things and he loved that, he talked about the Diamond Jubilee in 1950, but there was about 15,000 dancers in the LA area that came in and danced on the street, and about another 35,000 spectators. So he put together one of the largest square dance events at that time, and it was huge. It was on the streets, and of course, dancing on concrete is not all that great. So he figured and got people to bring in these rubber pellets, and they danced on these rubber pellets that kind of smoothed out the concrete. And there is, if you go on YouTube, you can reference the Diamond Jubilee. I don't know if any of you have had that ability to do that, but it's online, and there's some photographs of it, and so it's quite the place. In 1951, he established one of the first square dance vacation institutes at Asilomar, and in California on the coast there. That's up the Monterey Peninsula. Daryl, I think you were involved at Asilomar on a level, and Brian, I'm not sure if you went there.
No, unfortunately.
I know that Art Shepard came in from New Zealand. Daryl, did you do a Sealamar?
Yes. Yeah, that was one of the things that I probably would have mentioned about Bob. Of course, I knew Bob from Caller Lab, right up there at the beginning of it and everything. But I got a call from Bob one evening. Of course, I'm in Oregon, he was in California, and he said, "Daryl, got to thinking maybe you'd like to be involved in this Sealamar weekend that we do down on the Monterey Peninsula." I said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, I'll tell you right up front, I can't pay you much, but I can make you famous." How's that for a statement from Bob Osgood? He wasn't wrong. Now, I don't know if he made me famous or not, but I'll tell you what, I was involved in one of the highlights of my calling career. Yeah, that was back in the, I believe in the 70s, pretty much so when we started that. But I got to call along with another caller. You probably heard of him, Marshall Flippo. It was a weekend that we did together down there. We had Charlie Proctor for the round dance cure, and of course, Bob Osgood was there for rounds. What a fantastic weekend. And one of the things I remember most about that weekend was not about Bob, it was about Becky. Becky Osgood, his wife. Now, I can tell you about after parties we had down there and everything, but there was not an after party that went on down there that Becky Osgood did not approve of before it happened. The caller cure meeting we would have, and each of us had to go through everything that was going to happen in our after party things. And she had to approve it. They were a very, very nice couple, extremely nice couple. And yes, just the fact that I was associated with Mr. Flippo was absolutely fantastic. Other callers would show up for the weekend. Frank Lane was always there.
Right.
Yeah, I got to associate with a lot of the real legends of the activity. It was so good for me. And yes, Bob produced Sets in Order Square Dancing magazine, which back in those days, it was really something to be able to sit down and write a patter figure, put a name on it, because every figure was named back in those days.
That's right.
Send it off to Sets in Order and have it published. So your name was getting out associated with all his material. Bob just did so much for the activity. It was unbelievable. With that, I'll let you go back to work, Mike.
You know, the amazing thing about a Sealamar is that it was a beautiful hall with incredible acoustics, and it was designed by the same lady, architect, that designed Hearst Castle. And so a lot of the buildings on the Sealamar site, which is right on the Monterey Peninsula, right on the coast there, remind you a little bit of Hearst Castle. And the hall was absolutely gorgeous. And you're absolutely right. We did after parties every night after a dance, and they were organized by one of the members on the staff, but everything had to be approved by Becky Osgood. The amazing thing is that we would have dinner in a giant hall, and then come and sit in the hall afterwards, all the chairs pull out, and Bob would talk and tell stories. Now, you'd normally think that after dinner, half the crowd would be asleep, but Bob had a way of talking and telling stories that kept everybody's attention and everybody right on it. It was fabulous. I learned so much from him, and very often he would just stop and he would teach styling, or he would do something that was on the stage, and to everybody there, dancers and all of us alike. He was a wonderful teacher. But at that time, he had retired from calling. This was in the 70s when I was invited to take Lee Helsel and Bruce Johnson's place, which was incredible. But it was a time where he would, like I say, he would show some styling points. He would teach, but he prompted contours and loved contour dancing. When I was in dental school, I joined his. My wife and I joined his contour group and went to contour college just before the '76 Nationals. So I still prompt contours in the way Bob taught them. And but the interesting thing about him is that in 1957, he went on a 11-week tour of Germany, France, North Africa, England, and he taught the military square dancing and taught callers to call. And that further spread square dancing into Europe and around the world. And this was in 1957. Lots of people, lots of the dancing in Japan and those areas came because Bob Osgood and Bob Van Antwerp took square dance tours to those areas. And so he really was instrumental in spreading square dancing around the world. But he saw the whole situation with square dancing and all the calls and becoming more difficult. And it was at that time that he gathered together 4 of his closest friends and callers, which was Lee Helsel, Bruce Johnson, Bob Van Antwerp, and himself. And they gathered at Sea Lamar and they began to make plans for Caller Lab. They felt like we needed organization and that callers needed to create programs that were universal, that were recognized all over the world. He felt like square dancing was, the associations were becoming over-organized and there was a lot of things going on that he was concerned about. So they developed about 13 points of concern, and that's how Caller Lab was formed at that time. But he not only received the Milestone Award and the Gold Card Award, but he received the Millennium Award at the 2001 National Square Dance Convention in Anaheim, which is the only one of its kind that has ever been given out. He's got a wonderful book as I see it. I would get that book. It's a wonderful book. The interesting thing about this book is my wife, Gail, who passed away about 11 years ago, but the last years of Bob's life, she would go over to his house 2 mornings a week and she'd say, Bob, just talk, just, and she was great about transcribing and could just type as fast as somebody could talk. And she created chapters and chapters for this book and typed that up. And but it was never put together until Paul Moore gathered all that material together and put it together into this book. So it's a tremendous book and great stories, and just literally were information that came out of Bob's mouth. The other thing that I think, if you don't have as a resource, that's a phenomenal resource, is this caller text. There is so many articles in the caller text that were written by various callers in the Hall of Fame and that were kind of in the beginning of our activity. There's phenomenal information in there about calling and about different aspects of teaching. So I think it's a wonderful resource. There's another resource that I used in the early years, and a lot of us have used, the caller text. That was another one of his resources. Today, we're fortunate enough to have the knowledge base that's out there. And I'm sure most of you have used that as a resource. If you ever want to teach a call, if you ever want to get an article about anything in square dancing, go to the Caller Lab website and go to the knowledge base, and you'll pick up some amazing information that almost anything you're looking for is on that knowledge base. So the entire set of Sets in Order American Square Dance magazines have been scanned, and they're on the internet. So if you ever wanted to know about a caller, I had somebody that was asking me about a caller his uncle used to call, and we just Googled him, and he was a caller of the month in Sets in Order in 1961 or something. And so we were able to just read about his uncle, and it was right there from American Square Dance Society. So it was a fabulous resource, and he was an amazing guy. Anybody have any questions or maybe stories? Brian, you probably have it. Well, we were talking about some of the things that your experience was with Bob.
No, I don't have a lot of stories that I can tell about Bob. I really enjoyed his company. I had a couple of meals with him at Caller Lab from time to time. And I spent a bit of time with him when he and Bob Van Antwerp were over here. I think it was probably in the early 70s,
Okay.
maybe late 60s, early 70s. They came over to a dance, and at that stage we were doing some of the movements differently to the way they were later described that we should be doing them. And they put us on the right track, actually. The callers in Australia got together after Bob and Bob had been here and said, look, I think maybe we should take their advice and do things the way that everybody else in the world is doing them. And we did. The only things that we do differently now, we do our promenades differently because we do an escort position with the boy's arm around the girl's waist and the lady's left and boy's left hand held, and promenade that way. And our alimans are done with the fingers pointing towards the ceiling. You know, all our arm turns, the turn throughs, aliman lefts, aliman rights, aliman thars are all done like that. And it was Bob Osgood that pointed out to us that we were doing these things differently to everybody else in the world. At that stage, it hadn't mattered because there wasn't a lot of interchange of dancers going from one country to another. But it was nice to be put on the right track by somebody as famous as Bob Osgood.
The story that I got about the pigeon wing Alaman, of course, that's the way they do it in contra dancing, but the story that I got was Joe Louis, one of the original traveling callers like Bob, went to Australia and showed that. Now, is that the truth that it was?
The reason, yeah, it's a very interesting story, actually. The directors of one of our major department stores in Australia got married, and he went to America on his honeymoon. And while he was there, he attended a function where square dancing was done as a demonstration. And Joe Louis happened to be the caller that was calling for the demonstration. And this director was fascinated that most of the people were dressed in a check material. And he had a warehouse back here in Australia full of check material that wasn't selling. So he decided that he would invite Joe over to Australia to see if he could get an interest in this material being sold. If he thought, if people start square dancing, they might like to wear check material, and he'd sell this warehouse full of check material. So the way we do our promenade was designed to show off the material. The boy would take a handful of girl's skirt in his left hand and her left hand, and he'd put his arm around the girl's waist. The girl would hold out the rest of the skirt with her right hand. So the boy's legs were covered by the girl's skirt. So they were promenading around and showing this material off. So that's why we do our promenades the way we do. But I still prefer to do it that way now, because if I'm dancing with the hands crossed in front and both hands joined, the girls can't hold their skirts out. And also I feel as though I'm dragging the girl around the square. Whereas if I've got my arm around the girl's waist, I feel as though we're dancing as a couple.
Nice, nice. The other thing about Bob that I was amazed about is he was a great after party person. He loved to do after parties and skits, and he loved to do pantomimes. He did some of the most amazing pantomimes. He and Bob Van did one, the old Deo, Deo, daylight come, and they did a thing that was just a crack up, and so they really kind of opened my eyes to the whole world of after parties, and we just it was a real privilege working with Bob over the years. He was an amazing speaker. He loved a certain amount of the styling, and as Seastrom, the one of the things about the Highland Fling in the back-to-back do-sa-do, he just basically said, if we call a Highland Fling, you do an arm around do-sa-do. If we call a do-sa-do, we'll do a back-to-back do-sa-do, and that's the way we ran it. And he always was concerned about styling. Dan, anything other questions, maybe discussion that's been on before?
Well, I suspect, especially given at least one comment in the chat here, that a lot of people haven't read As I Saw It. I have. So don't really have a sense of Bob as the promoter that kind of drove the National Square Dance Convention, drove the whole push to get the whole state square dance in every state thing, all of those other things, which were certainly part of the boom at that point, and I think are part of the challenge that we're marketing against now, because it was very much an activity of the establishment in the way that he marketed it. Wonder if you could kind of talk to that sense of what he was marketing, what he was building the activity as, and how we're seeing the fallout from that now. And yeah,
I'd love to address that. Interesting enough, there was a lot of push to advertise square dancing like as an advertisement, use money and advertise it out there. His big concern was that there were many places, and the same is true today, and I'm sure in all the countries where everyone calls it's the same way, that there's pockets of areas that you could advertise this, but there's no callers there to teach it. And so there is no square dancing in those areas. And so he felt like it was always better to be able to advertise it on a state level or an association level where there were callers that could actually teach and deliver the product. I think square dancing largely, the costumes especially, were because of how popular cowboys were in the United States. Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, a lot of those, the singing cowboy, the cowboy shows on television, the movies, all of that was driven, our costumes were driven by that. And one of the things that I had a huge discussion with Bob that's one of the most memorable to me is he had an office in his Beverly Hills home that had photographs all around the outside of this office. And in those photographs, they went from year to year. So it started out in the 30s and it showed a square in the 1930s and what their costume was. And of course, it looked nothing like Western at all. It had, regular shoes and regular, shirts, and there were no cowboy things, and women had longer dresses. And he also had a photograph from the 40s. And in the 40s, again, there were no cowboys at that time. The guys were wearing hats. And I said, Bob, why were all the guys wearing hats? He said, everybody, the guys wore hats back then. It followed the costuming of the, society. Then we went into the 50s and you started to see the, puffy skirts and, crinolines and some of that stuff. And of course, cowboy, look a little bit more with the guys, and partly because cowboys were so popular. And that's basically what he said. He said, that was and he said, and then we had the puffy skirts and the that's when that costume started to come, in the 50s. In the 60s, it further bumped up a little bit more of that kind of costume. And again, back in the Chris, do you have?
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you, really. I was just gonna, my one and only Bob Osgood story, because I'm just a baby, was just what a friendly guy he was. And I called him up sometime in the late 90s, I guess it was, to ask him questions about the exactly what you're talking about. And he gave me the rundown on the history of the costumes, and it completely matches exactly the description that you're giving.
It was interesting because he sat in his chair as I walked around his office and stood in front of these photographs and said, so how about this 60s and 70s and 80s situation? Our costume is literally frozen and is nothing like the costumes that people were wearing at the time. And, particularly bell bottoms and all that stuff. And he said, square dancers started to manufacture their own clothes. In these early years, when the costume kind of started to develop, women sewed. And at least in the United States, more women sewed, and they sewed their own costumes. But in the 70s and the 80s, much of that disappeared, and square dance manufacturers were manufacturing square dance attire for profit, so as to speak, and our costumes literally froze at that time. Now we're seeing the decrease in the number of manufacturers, and we're seeing our costume change. But I was fascinated by that explanation, and he basically stuck to his guns. Anytime we talked about a national advertisement in square dancing, he said, you're going to just advertise to areas that don't have square dancing, and those people are going to be looking for it and won't be able to find it. So his feeling about publicity was targeted in the specific areas that have callers. So good question, Dan.
As an aside here, I've been listening to a history of country music called Cocaine and Rhinestones by Tyler May and Co., David Allen Coe's son. And he has been, for the entirety of season 2, pulling in these intros, which seem to have absolutely nothing to do with country music. Bullfighting and the Borgias in Italy and all of this. And the last episode, he tied it all together into the rise of Western wear in the Buffalo Bill show in the late 1800s, and how that came into the goofy fringe and all of these other things that we later became to associate as Western, that led into kind of the whole Bakersfield overly rhinestoned nudie. I forget his last name, but the nudie suits, and yeah.
Exactly. I mean, nudie was big in LA, and of course all the cowboys had stuff, and we had square dance callers in LA that had nudie do their clothes, their coats, their suits, and they dressed like that to when they all the way through until they finally retired. So it's interesting that image of square dancing was created more by society at that time and the popularity of country western. The thing I'd say about Bob too is that when you talk to Bob he talked to you about you. He always asked, how are you doing? What do you think about that? And he was an amazing guy that was interested in you, had his focus. Whenever you talked to him, you had 100% of his attention. And he was a gem of a man in that way. Excuse me.
So yeah, so he had Sets in Order, an American Square Dance, and of course famously his club involved most of the Warner Brothers animators, because Hillbilly Hair came out of that. You talk a little bit about his evolution, and I think that he came out of World War II as like a soft drink marketer and then decided to go over to square dance. Can you talk a little bit more about that part of his biography?
Yeah, that's exactly right. He came out of the war and he worked in the soft drink industry, and of course all their promotions and that kind of thing. So that was a major influence, I think, marketing wise with him. But he had kind of a well-rounded perspective of marketing from the cola information and he also had a lot of influence with Lloyd Shaw and the Lloyd Shaw dancers. He had his hands in a lot of different things, and he traveled, took groups to over 50 countries, and he and Bob in Antwerp. And so I think he was just at that point in time was at the perfect place to promote square dancing. And of course, his magazine was a wonderful magazine that was pointed at callers and dancers alike. So like I say, I was fortunate to have him as a mentor and to be here in Los Angeles to experience that. Daryl?
Yeah, one short comment about the dress code as such. I did ask Bob about that once. He said, well, all of those dress manufacturers, they advertise in my magazine. I didn't have to say anything after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, Bob was a great guy. The only time I ever got to visit him at his home, I think, well, it was after I had been in Color Lab long enough. I think the reason I was there was because he wanted to talk about the Color Lab quarterly selection. program before it got going there. And of course, I was supposed to be the first committee chairman of that. And we had a nice visit. I can't tell you much about it. It's been too long ago now. That was back, ooh, Lordy, I don't know. I'd have to look up the years on that. One thing I was sitting there and he mentioned, now I can't remember the name of the actor, but anybody that's old enough remembers a TV show, Dr. Kildare.
Oh, right.
The star of that lived right across the street from him there.
Richard Chamberlain.
Richard Chamberlain, that's who it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, yeah, Bob was very impressive, very, very impressive guy. And as far as the costuming, Henry Ford had something to do with dress codes early on in the square dance. He promoted square dancing very large. He wanted his employees to all square dance, and they had their rules that he'd set up for their dress code and everything. And as far as the changing through the decades, there was a time that those dresses, the skirts, were ankle length, and they all had to be ironed out. And on the way to the dance, the ladies would sit in the back seat of the car so they could spread that long skirt out that didn't get all wrinkled and everything. I'm sure that as time went by and the crinolines and the flared skirts and everything came along, and the nylons and Orlon material, the never pressed material came along, everything changed, partly because it could. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, the other thing, Bob invited me to Color Lab in '76, and I flew out there with him and flew back, and he said, "Well, what did you think?" And I said, on the way back, I said, I said, "Bob, one thing that I'm disappointed at, the number of callers that just bicker with each other. It's almost there's some lack of respect for each other." And he said to me, he said, "Well, I'll tell you," he said, "Color Lab is a very young organization." And at that time it's 2 years old or so. He said, "So I may not see it in my lifetime, but I think you're going to see a time when callers literally respect each other because they picked up a microphone, they're working at it, they're teaching, they're learning, and we help each other out." And he says, "I think you'll see that in your lifetime. I may not in mine." And he passed away in 2003. And in the next couple of years, I had seen a behavior at Color Lab conventions that to this day delights me. There was a time where, and Daryl, you might remember, Cal Golden had not been to a Color Lab convention in a lot of years. His wife was very ill. He was taking care of her. But she passed, and the following year he came to Color Lab. Now, he was at that time using a walker, and he was at the registration place, and when I walked in and saw him, and he registered, and then he began to walk down the aisle, and people would say, you could hear the conversation of everybody against the walls, like, "That's Cal Golden. That's Cal Golden." Before the convention was over, everybody wanted to talk to Cal just to get stories. It was a level of respect that was shown to him. He was no longer calling, hadn't been calling in years, but for what he did and for his accomplishments, it was marvelous to see that respect. Flippo taught us the same thing. At Flippo, I don't care how many years you called, Flippo respected you as a caller, and that kind of behavior, that mutual respect that we have for each other, I think has grown more and more and more. And I think it's our key to going forward. We support each other and respect each other, and we got a great chance of this activity growing. So I'm excited about the future, to get out of this pandemic and get back to some dancing. So
it was really, really easy. Now I got a year on you, Mike, for Color Lab. It started in '74. I got the invitation. Back in those days, invitation only. If you didn't get an invitation, you didn't get into Color Lab. At 1975, and I got in the same year. Elmer Sheffield. Now, probably some of you have heard of him, but I can remember sitting in the coffee shop with Elmer and watching these guys go by. And we were awestruck. These huge, huge names to us. Every record that we bought, everything, our article, everything was about all of these people. And we're sitting there, supposedly part of them, no way. You talk about Bob Van Antwerp and Arnie Cronenberger and all of the guys, you know, that we looked up to. Yeah, Color Lab was pretty neat back in those days. And it was all because of Mr. Bob Osgood.
It was where your heroes became your peers. And it was a fabulous experience. And I think even today, there is a level of camaraderie at a Color Lab convention that allows us to share that respect for each other. But you're right, Daryl, it was amazing. So any other questions about Bob? I'd strongly recommend this book. It's a great book. It's a great read. We got a book on Flippo too that's just a fabulous read too. So
I'm going to have to get the Flippo book. I loved the Sets in Order, and it's part of why I facetiously, well, a little bit trolling, say Bob Osgood is responsible for the decline of square dancing today, because that image of square dancing that he was pushing feels very of its time and static. But I like that you have said that, yes, he acknowledged that it was going to be moving and that it was
yeah. He said, because when he passed, before he passed, he said that you're seeing the decline in the square dance manufacturers, and he said our costume is going to continue to evolve like it has over the years. And again, I think largely that image, that cowboy thing that was so much a part of our image today, that people think of yeehaw in the barn. And I mean, how many one night parties do you guys do? And they've got 2 bales of hay at the party, and you're thinking, God, I haven't seen hay at a square dance in a lot of years. You know, what's the deal with hay? And but that image again is part of the cowboy image and the barn image that Bob was very much. No, that's not part of square dancing. The dance is what's all about.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, because I mean that was certainly the era of hee haw and all of the heyday of country music, and country music before outlaw country, for whatever that term means in the genre, kind of made it a little bit more acceptable for the counterculture to be that. So I guess I'm trying to formulate the question that elicits what was his vision of square dancing then in the context of that culture, and how it could evolve? Because of course we're all looking for, like, what can we turn square dancing into now that might actually be popular, that might find a place. And he was good at figuring the zeitgeist of the times.
He was one of the first to say that square dancers are the bricks, but the what holds all those bricks together is the social part of square dancing, and the interaction where you could go to a dance and people from all walks of life would gather together and get along and share in this fun of dancing, moving to music. I mean, he would say, you know, you look at every celebration of life throughout mankind in the years, and there's involved music and or dancing as part of that celebration. And he said, this is a celebration where people come together. I mean, I called for his club. I was a club caller for his club in the final years that club was in existence, and they had people from all walks of life. Again, the Chuck Jones, who was the animator for Bugs Bunny, was actually worked with Bob with the Square Dance magazine. So we have artwork in some of the Square Dance magazines that Chuck Jones did. And Chuck was a major player in his Square Dance club over the years, but later was out of square dancing and was a very prolific cartoonist. And one of my real treasures is a Chuck Jones sketch that I have that was given to me by Bob's daughter. But it was part of that he enjoyed with dancing. But his emphasis, and I think our emphasis going forward, is to bring out the social aspect of this activity, where people can have fun together, people from all walks of life that would normally not gather together, because we share this fun of this dance. And it's a team dance. It's not a dance where you get out there individually. And that's one of my favorite things. I think a lot of times our image of square dancing is tied with the name of square dancing. And I've even gone as far as saying we ought to call it team dancing. And there's times when I'm calling in the schools, I say I'm coming there to teach you team dancing, because I don't want them to have this preconceived notion that we're going to be having hay and we're going to be in the barn and that kind of thing. So that image has followed us for years. The music, same thing. When you get old time squeaky fiddles and stuff like that have a level of recording it, like our old recordings, our music today is the best it's ever been. And because we have current techniques and the blend and the engineering with instruments is so much better than it was back then. So it's I'm excited about our future going forward, because I think we have a tool now that we can teach a whole lot less to our dancers and get them into the program and get them involved in the social aspects and the social benefits of our dance.
One of the things that I'm struggling with is the notion of that, like, Contra is still going ahead with 3-piece combos, kind of the same music they've had, and square dancing in Bob Osgood's time very much adopted the popular music of the time, even as that was stuff that we kind of look at as a little hokey today. That kind of pre-outlaw country can get really hokey. But yeah, how much of that culture is the useful part, and how much of it should I just run screaming from? Because I'm a really new caller and really new to square dancing too. So yeah,
I think a lot of us migrate to the type of music that we're comfortable with. And so I think the age of the caller, it has an awful lot to do with the type of music we use and are comfortable with. You see, and there's current music that gets sprinkled in to our square dance, but because our caller audience is somewhat older, you're not going to sell music, the current music of, say, Shawn Mendes or Ed Sheeran or something like. You're not going to sell that kind of music to our current callers, and they're not going to use it. But yeah, again, there's if the music is solid and fun to dance with, and is done currently, where the music techniques are so well put together, I think that we can use music that, especially pattern calls and things like that. Again, you want to still use music that appeals to your dancers. So you look out there at the age of your dancer, and you need to match that a little bit more too. But I think, again, music is evolving, and our dance is evolving, and our costume is evolving, just like it always has. And when you look at back in the 20s and the 30s with Henry Ford and some of the formal things that went on back at that time, and it's evolving, and that's a good thing, I think.
Can you talk a little bit more about I noticed that Buddy Weaver is trying to start another a square dance magazine, and I'm trying to figure out how magazines fit. And of course, the Australians keep publishing the wonderful Mic Time or Behind the Mic. Talk a little bit more about the how the magazines, the cultural niche that they fit within calling and square dancing, and like what we're missing out now by not having the Bob Osgood magazines.
Well, the interesting thing is, along with that magazine, there were two magazines at that time. There was Sets in Order, American Square Dance Society, and there was American Square Dance Magazine. American Square Dance Magazine, that was formerly owned by Stan Burdick, was and Stan and Kathy, was really around a couple of years before Bob published his Sets in Order. And that Square Dance Magazine, American Square Dance, went from Stan and Kathy out here to the West Coast, back to Rhode Island, down to Florida. The current owner that Buddy took over that magazine from was struggling with it. Her husband passed away. She was having a tough time. Buddy took that over, and Buddy's going to make a digital version of that, which is, if you don't get it, check it out. But it's that magazine will have to grow and change a little bit. But the fact that it's digital now, the fact that the Behind the Mic in Australia with Barry Wanson is out. We now have a couple caller note services. There used to be 10 caller note services that were available, from Bill Peters to Deuce Williams to, there was a ton of note services out there. And now we have, I think, one note service, Lawrence Cooley. Lawrence, you're still publishing. I don't know if Lawrence is still with us, but he had has a note service from Europe. There is a note service that just came out from John Carlton and Ralph Trout that's fairly new. There's choreography, of course, in American Square Dance Magazine that Buddy now owns, that comes out from Steve Kopman and has been there for years and years. Plus, there's the resource of the internet and how many callers have published modules and things on the internet that are available too. So I think everything largely is switching to the internet and to our computers, but there's a tremendous amount of information that's available. And I'm excited that Buddy's taken over the American Square Dance Magazine. When Bob retired in 1985, he took all of his subscriptions and, I don't know, sold them or gave them to Stan. So all of the subscriptions to that magazine, then that two magazines were combined in 1985. And so the magazine that Bob did, he was the editor from 1948 to 1985, and that was the end of Sets in Order, American Square Dance Society. All of his material, the Hall of Fame caller portraits, all of that went to the Lloyd Shaw Foundation and now is in the University of Denver in their dance resource. So that chapter's closed of Sets in Order, basically, but the American Square Dance Society, I'm excited to see Buddy take that over and see that go.
So with the caller note services and with I think I've been back through, I inherited when I started calling, inherited the usual box full of important papers that several local callers gave me, and that has some old issues, and I went back through them, and there were some like featured calls and figures that seemed like they were part of creating a media of the time.
Mm-hmm.
That it was like when everybody came together for a dance, there would be some common material that everybody would be like more familiar with.
Right.
And of course, these days, getting dancers to go dance with another club is like pulling teeth and hard to do, or difficult to work out. Did that lead to a feeling of kind of like that larger family of square dancing? What was the vibe of that?
Well, at that time in the urban areas, particularly in the early 70s and through the 60s and the early 70s, that vast amount of the number of calls that were being written at the time. One of the caller note services that featured all of those new calls was Bill Davis's New View. And that New View would have anywhere from 10 to 50 new calls a month that were listed. And sometimes it was a call that was a different name of a previous call, and Bill knew that, and worked with Burleson's magazines, and he would feature some of those calls. But there was a tremendous amount of material coming out at that time, and Caller Lab kind of took that and put it down into the quarterly selections, because you'd go from, particularly in the urban areas, you'd go from one dance to another dance, and there might be a series of 2 or 3 calls that were used by this club that weren't used by that club. And so a lot of our Plus program had come out of those calls that were being juggled around amongst the clubs, from like teacup chain and spin chain the gears and spin chain through. And a lot of those calls were kind of experimental calls at those times. And so to take all those and kind of put them in a list, or on in some category where clubs knew that people could go from club to club in an urban area. And I think people still to this day will travel. A lot of clubs visit, and in the areas where there are clubs close by. The other areas where they're farther, it's maybe a little bit more of a production to get people to go from one club to another. But I still think visiting and the conventions and festivals is a fun part of square dancing. Not that everybody will get involved in that, but still, it's part of it.
I remember the absolute, like, the way that square dancing went from okay, this is a fun hobby that we do once a week, to oh my God, we've got to get every weekend, when we went to our first away event. And then, yeah. And even now, I am completely missing not getting to the IAGSTC this year, and those other big festivals.
Yeah. That's part of the camaraderie that is created at a weekend event, that all those people at that particular event share in this common experience and see each other repeatedly throughout a weekend. And those friendships develop where people, they'll maybe see it at a national convention, or a state convention or something like that. And that camaraderie comes together. And it's just part of those weekends. Not every dancer gets involved in that. They may just go to their local school that they club dances at, and that's their perspective of square dancing. But I think the fact that we have a vehicle now that's a good possibility of being able to teach several classes a year. When I first started calling, and I know Daryl, you're the same way, we taught at least 2 classes a year. And then in the spring and the fall, and then it's morphed over those years to 1 class a year. And then people that would actually survive that entire year of lessons and not say I'm done, and that kind of thing. I'm excited about the fact that we now have something we can teach more than 1 or 2 or 3.
Sets in order 50 basics, right?
Yep. That's what we thought.
And of course, that was the control of the amount of material that was being introduced, was one of the major reasons for the establishment of Caller Lab.
Right.
That's why they pulled together what they considered was the names of the activity, and of course later asked us to join them too. Was just to gain some kind of control. You talk about Bill Davis. Well, Bill Peters had one, Dick Hunt had one, Les Gocher had one, Jay King had one. There were so many note services. There was 30, 40, 50 new movements, because people like Mike Seastrom and Daryl Clendenin wrote these new movements and sent them off to Bill Peters, and he published them out there. Part of the promotion of us newer callers too. I think you probably did some of that, Mike. I'm not sure.
I never wrote a call, and yet there were guys like Don Beck, for instance, that wrote some pretty amazing calls that are still part of our programs: chain down line, ping pong circulate, things like that fit into our programs like that. So but it was part of the time. There were dancers that were writing calls because they got so.
Will Orlick was he put a ton of stuff into the activity, but they needed to control that some way. Therefore, Collar Lab. That was probably the main reason. Let's get together and get control of this. And it did work up to a point. That combined with the quarterly selection, which we would go through, we would find movements that looked like they had promise, and let the membership of Collar Lab look at them, vote on them, put them out for that 3-month period. And that meant everybody everywhere was going to teach the same movement at every dance for that next 3 months, and then throw it away. And it would control the amount of material that was being spread around. And that worked.
Right.
The only problem is everybody didn't throw those movements away.
Yeah, some of those movements stuck around to become part of
Yeah.
the Plus program.
Plus level after a while. And then that wasn't enough. So we had +1 and +2. And they said, whoa, this is worse than what we had before. We got to get rid of this. So they combined it all into one program made up of the most popular calls. And it's the Plus program that's danced today. But it does control the input of new movements. And whether you like the idea of having it or not, I'll leave that up to everybody else.
You got it. It was never meant to teach the entire basic mainstream and Plus program in 1 year. And so I think that's when square dancing got in trouble. And that was largely fueled by dancers and dance, because the leaders in the clubs were the experienced dancers, and they loved some of those experimental calls that were now part of the Plus program. And so, but like I say, I'm excited that we might get back to an easier program and teach more than one class a year.
I think that that's one of the problems with collar or with dancer run clubs, is that we get the people who really get into the mathematics of square dancing and the wanting the novelty. And so we have in the Bay Area, everybody says the rush to Plus, but in the Bay Area, it sure feels like the rush to challenge going on.
Yeah.
So I'm noticing the time, and this is when Don usually breaks in and says, it has been an hour, and if you feel like you want to drop off, do so without compunction, but otherwise the conversation will keep going here. And I'm quite enjoying the conversation as long as I can find good questions to keep Mike going and all of the others, because it's wonderful to get the history and context of some of these things and hear the ways that the quarterly selections and the throwaway calls and all of these other things that I never got a chance to experience have happened. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mike. You were going somewhere with that.
No, it's interesting because the quarterly selections taught us a few things. One of the things that was popular that wasn't on a list was the Grand Colonel spin. And that came out, we thought, oh, let's make that a quarterly selection. So it came out as a quarterly selection, but dancers could not dance that figure unless it was with the K-Lox version of the grand spin, the bridge over River Kwai. We realized that there are, in much like in contra dancing or in traditional dancing, there are some figures that just go with a particular piece of music in dance. And that's one of them that the dancers just could not really successfully do that figure unless it was with that piece of music. And that really kind of woke up my eyes a little bit. The other thing is that you realize that there's only so far a dancer understands. One of the quarterly selections was transfer the column. And you try to teach that to mainstream dancers, and they have that concept of first two dancers in the column, doing this, and the trailing dancers doing that. That was way beyond people's, casual dancers' ability to grasp that. And we realized that's really got to be a call that sits up at the advanced program. Linear cycle, when that came out as a quarterly selection, we basically taught it and drugged the girls through the whole call, from a normal standard position. And same thing with recycle. When recycle first came out, We taught it, the girls kind of do a U-turn back and everybody wheel and deal. And we actually had a petition. There was a petition in Canada signed by Canadian women that said, this is horrible call, get rid of this thing. You're just dragging us. I mean, callers would say, recycle and let's pull them on around. I mean, that was common choreography at the time. I remember Lee Kopman at a Caller Lab convention just chewing us up and down the line about this is a no hands call and linear cycle is a no hands call. I mean, he just chewed us up because we were teaching it wrong and people were getting drugged around, So it's over the years, that program, those experimental calls, and literally when the quarterly selection program was at its peak, was we still had 10, 12, 15 calls coming out every month from dancers, from callers, from, and we were trying to narrow it down to one call instead of all these other calls. I think the one thing that we used to do at dances prior is occasionally we would expose a dancer to a simple call, a different sort of thing to equalize the floor and to give that dance kind of a unique feel. And I think that's one of the advantages. I was talking with Ken Bauer about this, and he said, we used to do that, and maybe getting back to or doing something like the SSD program will give us the ability to take a little short, cute little figure that changes body flow a little bit and be able to introduce that really simple. And boom, you've got something that's unique to that particular dance. And I'm excited about the ability to do that because I think there's nothing wrong with bringing an experimental or something unique down to your dance, but we may have the ability to do that. Whereas now there's so much, like in a plus program, there's so many things to call that are just associated with the calls that you can add all that variety in. So,
right. Great to hear that, the history of recycle, because I loathed recycle as a dancer, and it wasn't until somebody called out my bad teaching of it at a caller school that it was like, oh, this is actually a really cool move if it's done right.
Yeah. Having that center dancer fold instead of spinning around in a circle, it's really, but I got such a kick of Lee Kopman, and at the time at the Colorado Convention, he had some stature, but boy, he minced no words. He just chewed us up and down, and I was kind of grinning through the whole thing because we're just being lashed for the way we're teaching this thing, and he gave us the bit on it, boy. So we met some unique people. We have some unique. We're all characters. Let's face it. We've been around long enough. And I think that part of our activity is what's so fun. We really have been including partners and callers. Mel, you had a hand up. Mel?
Yeah, well, just one comment on the recycle first was when I learned it, I was in Germany at the time, and I thought clapping hands was part of the movement because it was taught the first thing you do is clap hands, take a small step forward. That was part of recycle in the teaching. Everybody did that. Didn't matter where you were. And it was one of those sounds of square dancing that has been dropped out, but it really re-emphasized that body flow of a forward flowing action rather than the dragging. And it was just for that reason in particular. What I had my hand up is I just wanted to go back. A couple of things you mentioned about Bob was, and these are secondhand anecdotes, by the way, that I picked up at Caller School, but one of them that came up was the question of square dance clothing. I don't know at any time whenever Bob was involved in a discussion that the question of square dance clothing didn't come up, and he was quite vocal on that. And he's the one that quipped the phrase that it has to evolve with the times or it'll be the death of square dancing. But it's also when they asked about our traditional square dance clothes, he's the one that said, do you know why they wear a crinoline? Because in the 50s and 60s, no self-respecting woman would be seen going out to a square dance wearing pants. The fashion of the time was the hoop skirt and the long skirts or short skirts for the younger ladies. That's what it is. And he says the reason square dancing is going to die is because they're going to stop, and that'll become the argument. And they didn't pass that on to the dancers. They passed that on to the callers, the history of all of this. There's a lot of those things, and I loved your presentation today, that this history is shared with the callers, but the dancers today don't understand a lot of this, and they don't understand that. So they get locked into that mindset of this is the way it is, rather than this is the way it needs to evolve. And I fully agree with it. SSD along that same line. I'm still sitting kind of on the fence of SSD. I fully support the program. I fully support, we had a good 50-50 movement program before, we just didn't know how to use it properly. The second one was Bob. This was passed on by Marshall Flippo. Actually, Bob was always the caller of respect, and it didn't matter if you were new. And he's the one that not coined the phrase, but at caller schools, a new caller struggling or anything like that was your peer. And he's the first one that I ever heard of that walked up to another caller, a brand new caller that was really struggling behind the mic, stopped him, made him do it again, and says, I like that, I'm stealing that. Didn't matter if it was something that was old, something new, just that uniqueness to make that caller feel good that, yeah, you made a lot of mistakes, but this is the way we're going to critique. What is good? I'm stealing that. That is good. That is good. That is good. Hey, and you may want to improve it. Keep going on that. That's fantastic. But you may want to improve on this a little bit. It was always positive. He was like the ultimate Oreo sandwich, if you will. You know, all the good stuff, and then that little bit of you need to work on this, and that filling would grow inside the Oreo, which is the improvement. And that's what I remember about the anecdotes, Bob. He was just the master of respect.
He really was, and showed respect to everybody. And Flip was the same way. And I just think we can learn from that kind of behavior, that we help each other out. It makes square dancing better in the long run, all the way around. And we all have our different quirks and ways we do things, and we all have things we can improve on. But I really enjoy the fact that we can learn from each other and help each other and just have fun with each other too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good stuff, Mel. Good stuff. He was that way with the costumes. He felt like it's going to be evolved with the times, and that will be part of our activity.
Yeah, it was just that aspect of what he was saying never got passed on to the dancers. Callers recognize it, but and as I said, it was him that got me at one dance. I went there, and it was, if you didn't have the dress code, you didn't come to the dance. And they turned dancers away. A lady had surgery on her leg and had big scars down her leg and didn't want to wear a dress because it showed she wore pants, and they were turning her away. And I went up on stage, and because I had a collarless shirt and a vest, it was a square dance outfit, but it was a collarless shirt, and the dress code was collar, bolo, all this other. So I started packing up the equipment. I said, well, I obviously don't meet your dress code. I can't call here. And I started packing up the equipment and they looked at me in absolute horror. They let the guys come into the dance on that after the fact, because I was going to stand. I was adamant. I was going to say, no, if there's dress code there, you're turning dancers away in a place where we're losing dancers. I'm packing up because I don't meet your standards. And it was, there's not a lot of callers that have the moxie to actually stand up and say, I'm in control of this floor. You're in control of the club, but I'm in control of this floor. And we want dancers on the floor to enjoy it.
Yeah.
I'd rather, I'm not sure if it was something stolen from you or Mike Sikorsky said, I'd rather see a hall full of dancers wearing blue jeans and sneakers than a square of dancers in an empty hall wearing lampshades and frou-frous. So.
David, I noticed your hand went up.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying hearing about Osgood and his comfort, his way of speaking, the kind of leadership that he provided on the Square Dance History Project. We've got two television programs that he hosted around 1950, and he is incredibly awkward as a speaker. It may be his first time on television, but I'm just fascinated looking at this man who is very awkward on camera until he latches into the patter, which is word for word what he has picked up from Lloyd Shaw, at which point everything is smooth. I'm just fascinated how he got from being so awkward to being such a polished and friendly and comfortable person So anything you can share about that that path that took him to that kind of comfort level. Thanks.
It's interesting because Bob basically was, I wouldn't say shy, but he, in a crowded group, Bob didn't necessarily stand up and become the center of attention. And one event catches my thought on that, David, and we did a one night stand for the LA Philharmonic Orchestra. Zubin Mehta was the conductor at the time, so we met at Zubin Mehta's house, and this was in 1976 on the 200th. It was on the anniversary of of the United States on July 4th, and we did this event. And of course, there were dignitaries. The mayor was there. All these people that were that were the musicians of the Philharmonic Orchestra. Bob brought in a band and was really in charge of organizing this whole thing from this one night party. We had a separate band. I was dancing at the time with his group of dancers, but he was totally in control of his part of the event. But next to a lot of others, he was not the person to stand up and take notice. And but when he ran the thing, like at a Asilomar, for instance, because he ran that puppy and he ran that for years, and he was in his element, and he could command the presence in a state like quality. If you've ever listened to the albums, the Sets in Order albums, and his introductions, I mean, his introductions were just stately, and just he had that down to a T. But as a personal thing, he was not, he didn't walk around like he owned the place. He was just a very kind of calm guy that was almost a little bit on the shy side. So yeah, that's a good point, David. That's one that I didn't think about. But when he was in his element, he stood up and he was a statesman. But when he was around others, he just took his spot. Regular guy.
Interesting. Another person for whom hiding behind the mic becomes a reasonable strategy.
I think if you look at a lot of callers out there, we have our awkward moments and our moments where we're, not overly confident about what we're doing. And I'm sure at those early television shows, he was somewhat intimidated by some of these stars and some of the people that he worked with. But there were times he had to step up and say, this is the choreography and this is the way we're going to do it. And so, I think you hit the nail on the head, David. In a lot of us early in our careers were a lot less, not so easy about doing what we were doing.
I think we only get jitters and whatnot on the days that end with the letter Y.
There you go. It's true. It's true. Sweden, we've got a couple callers and leaders from Sweden. I'm delighted because years ago when I was teaching a class, I had a couple that were loving square dancing, and he was working for the oil companies in the United States at the time, and he left to go and work in Saudi Arabia on the oil projects. And it turned out that he had a group of US people and Swedish people there that he wanted to continue with the class. And so his wife would tape our classes and send them over to him. And he had a group there in Sweden that in Saudi Arabia, but it was the Swedish workers and the US workers that got together and square danced together. And he was so excited to be able to be teaching kind of from these tapes and stuff. The first time I went to Sweden to call, one of the gals came up to me and said, I'm so tired of dancing to you. And I said, I just got here, and she said, but evidently I had tapes that had gotten over to Sweden. And so it's, but my family, my father's family, we're from Sweden. And so I have a great affinity for the dancers and the people in Sweden. Nice to have you guys here, Hannah, Lars. Good to have you guys.
It looked for a moment like Lars was going to pop in with a comment. I was going to provide an opening for him, but I guess not.
Lars, how long have you been dancing?
I started dance 88.
1988?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And I think I know who you mean worked in Saudi Arabia, because we say here in Sweden that the square dance came from Saudi Arabia to Sweden.
It was I think it was the US workers and the Swedish workers that got together because they, you know, had personalities that they enjoyed the dancing and
I think they lived in the same camp in Saudi Arabia, both US people and Swedish people.
yes, yes.
Both oil company and from LM Ericsson.
Yeah, it's amazing how the dance has spread around the world, and I think because of the social aspect. At that time, they worked really hard and they didn't have much to do, and square dancing was that social outlet for them.
And it started in several places in Sweden, both down in South Sweden and Stockholm and Gothenburg. Almost everyone origin from Saudi Arabia people, Ericsson or oil company.
Ah, okay.
And some
Yeah,
of the clubs are still active.
That's fantastic. Like I said, Osgood got around to places like Germany and France and those kind of places, and brought square dancing to our military personnel. Same thing in Japan. And there's a big contingent of square dancers in Japan, and came from the military. Taiwan, same thing in Taiwan. So
Historically, the same in Australia.
yes, yeah. So it's interesting how it has spread, and then we get a chance to share, you know, conversation like this.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we may have hit that lull in the conversation that indicates that we've kind of had the conversation for the morning, but I am excited and energized, and where I had been kind of like, I'm going to take some time before I restart the Petaluma group. Now I'm in like the chomping at the bit space. So thank you, Mike. This excited me.
Hey, great. I'm excited too. I think going forward, we have such a gem that we can, and boy, our people have been without this social contact for a long time, and people are ready to get back and get to that. So Brian, good to see you, Brian.
You know, I only came into this meeting to see Lisa, and I'm solely disappointed, and she's not on screen. What the hell?
I mean, I can hunt her down. I'm sure she's here. You and Lisa have this thing, and so it's all good. It's all good. Hey, Lisa. Brian Clark is on screen. Okay. She's not decent, so
Even better.
Even better. It's good to see you, Dan. I've enjoyed being here, and really enjoyed. I mean, Bob is a favorite subject of mine, and I'm so fortunate to have had him as a mentor that I'm really pleased. But definitely pick up this book. I think it gives you lots of stuff about Bob. And boy, you can go on the internet, and if you haven't been on the knowledge base picking up information and material, it is a fabulous resource. Barry Clasper, Dottie Welch, Chris Jensen, those three have done an amazing job with that, and it's such a fabulous resource. We're just blessed. So to be calling and teaching at this time, that's for sure.
Yeah, we've had Barry on before to talk about the knowledge base, and we have an embarrassment of riches. It's so hard to go back through, as a newer caller, it's so hard to go back through all of this old stuff and find the gems because they're there, but Well, there's a lot of material.
There is a lot of material, no doubt about it. It's like going through that box that was given to you by, another caller, and all that material that's in there, and boom, you come across a little gem that, or how somebody taught something or whatever. They're there. They're there. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Hey, I've enjoyed being here. Thank you guys for having me, and look forward to our paths crossing down the line. And I'm, like I say, I'm excited about getting back. We start our SSD class. I call for a plus club that we've taught all the way to plus for forever since I've been involved with them. And I finally told them I'm not doing it anymore. Let's do SSD. And the president, fortunately, as a new dancer, struggled, and he said, great, let's do it. So we're going to be doing 3 classes a year, and I'm excited.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Mike, so much. Thank you, everybody else, for participating. I'm going to give Don no end of hell for leaving me dangling like this, because I really miss his input to the conversation, but we'll
boy, under the circumstances, he's gonna have a messy weekend over there without power.
Yeah, he's gonna be digging his way out. And I think Don has something lined up for next weekend. So and if nothing else, at this point, I'm fired up enough that I might just fire it up and we'll all chat. Cool. Thank you very much. And I will post the recording as soon as it all comes through.
Hey, all right, Dan. Thanks a lot. And good to see Hannah and Lars. Good to see you guys. Mel, good to see you. It was great seeing Brian for a quick one, and of course Daryl Clendenin and Brian. Brian the Hot Cheese is a gem. Gosh, he has got some great choreography, and he's just a real fabulous person in our activities. So,
and David Millstone has dropped off, but thank you, David, for the contributions you made too. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Well, Dan, you take care. I'm going to run.
Yep.
You guys have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you down the line.
Good night or good day is appropriate.
Okay.
Take care, Mike.
You take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
There was a number of links that were posted. When you post this, can you just attach the links in a separate document? Are you able to do that?
What I usually do is I retime the comments so that they all come out even and post that in the thing. But yeah, I think I might run through and just grab the links out and put those up in the top of put those in the description of the YouTube thing.
Yeah, it was one of the comments that came out before, because tracking down the links, every now and then somebody put a link to something. And in this, I was just thinking, in this one in particular, you got the SIO link, you got the New England, you've got the Marshall Flippo link, you got Buddy Weaver's links, the podcasts, all of those. There's a list of links there that I think every caller should just pretty much have those bookmarked.
Yeah, although we get back to the embarrassment of riches problem, but yes. Yeah. Cool. All right.
No worries.
Catch you all.
I'll
later.
see some of you in about 3 hours.
Yes. Thank you
Cool.
for hosting, Dan.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.